Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our book discussion. Before we get started, I just need to let you all know that you'll be muted and your video will be off upon joining the Zoom webinar, and you'll have the opportunity to submit questions using the Q&A function. Please note that the conversation will be recorded. By participating, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, or voice possibly being recorded. I'm going to introduce our panelists today, starting with Professor Michael H. Allen. Michael H. Allen holds the Harvey Wexler Chair in Political Science at Bryn Mawr College, where he has taught for over 30 years. He has chaired the Department of Political Science and currently serves as Chair of International Studies and Associate Provost. Allen has published in the fields of international political economy and law, with special reference to Africa and the Caribbean. His books include Globalization, Negotiation, and the Failure of Transformation in South Africa, Revolution at a Bargain, and Democracy and Modernity in Southern Africa, Development or Deformity. He is a graduate of the University of the West Indies at Mona and London School of Economics, where he completed doctoral research as a Rhodes Scholar from Jamaica. Before his work at Bryn Mawr, Allen taught at the University of the West Indies and focuses on the dynamics of global capitalism and the constraints it places upon planetary sustainability and the possibilities for democracy and development within countries. Our next panelist is Professor Hoda Mahmoudi. She has held the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, College Park since 2012. As director of this endowed academic program, Professor Mahmoudi collaborates with a wide range of scholars, researchers, and practitioners to advance interdisciplinary analysis and open discourse on global peace. Before joining the University of Maryland faculty, Professor Mahmoudi served as the coordinator of the research department at the Bahá'í World Center in Haifa, Israel. Prior to that, Dr. Mahmoudi was dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern Illinois University, where she was also a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Professor Mahmoudi is co-author of A World Without War, co-editor of Fundamental Challenges to Peace and Security, The Future of Humanity, and co-editor of Systemic Racism in America, Sociological Theory, Education Inequality, and Social Change. She is also co-editor of Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Human Dignity and Human Rights, of The Challenging Ethos of Human Rights, and of Children and Globalization, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. And our last panelist today is Dr. Kate Seaman, who is Assistant Director of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. Dr. Seaman previously held positions at the University of Baltimore, the University of Bath, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of East Anglia. Dr. Seaman received her PhD from Lancaster University. She is the author of UN Tied Nations, the UN Peacekeeping and the Development of Global Security Governance. Dr. Seaman is the co-editor of The Changing Ethos of Human Rights and co-editor of Fundamental Challenges to Global Peace and Security, The Future of Humanity. Her research has also been published in the journals Global Governance and Politics and Governance. So we're very excited to have all of you here today to talk about this new edited volume. And I'm going to start out asking you some questions, and you can all respond in any order you prefer and just add your perspectives. So our first question is, how did you first conceptualize this volume? How did you decide what topics to cover, and why did you choose to do it now?
Maybe I can start off, if that's okay with everyone. Thank you very much, Stella, for that introduction. And I want to just mention that Stella is the graduate assistant at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, and she's moderating today's program. The way this book really came about is that the Bahá'í Chair is keenly interested in the role that global governance has in creating a better world for everyone, and of course, in moving humanity towards a more sustainable, peaceful society in general, a global society. And so in 2018, it set out to organize a large conference, a very wonderful conference, which was on the same theme of challenges it was called Challenges of Global Peace and Security Conference. And the conference, if I can just read a little bit, just 2 lines, that with increasing challenges to the creation of a sustainable global peace and the decline in security, new thinking and solutions are needed. This conference examines the limitations of the current global order and seeks to explore alternative solutions. So the Baha'i Chair is always looking for new thinking and alternatives to the world we have, and is interested in imagining a new and different world where there is equality for all, sustainability, and that the major issues, complex issues such as climate change, inequalities, the lack of global leadership that's unified, it's interested in all of these complex issues. And so the conference invited speakers to speak on these, the structural inequalities, the role of leadership and governments in this area, the role of technology and peace. And of course, under inequalities, it includes women, the equality of women, and the environmental degradation or climate change. I mean, these were some of the major issues that were covered. And so from that conference, where we had some of the most outstanding scholars in political science, international relations, and other fields speak to these issues, we decided that we should move forward and see if we can edit a volume to put all this important knowledge out there for not only students at universities, but faculty, for the public, whoever is interested in this topic. So that's how this book came to fruition. And we're very happy that it happened, because it's a very important contribution to the subject matter.
Yes. And speaking as a scholar from outside of the Baha'i Center, I just wanted to thank again Hoda in this forum for putting the conference and the book idea together, and for bringing this community of scholars to contribute in one space towards a conversation on these very necessary questions. I think the notion of a confluence of problems is useful, because often we think of climate change separate from inequality, separate from gendered issues, separate from governance, separate from world order. And to have a volume in which we take a planetary view, so to speak, a satellite view, and try to overlay the respective, the complex dynamics together to see them as a kind of a moving mosaic or kaleidoscope, whichever image we want to think of, I think was a very useful way of bringing the conversation into some kind of convergence. And also this idea, largely developed by Kate too, of including questions so that community groups who read the volume, perhaps outside of the walls of universities, can participate in the conversation through these questions. So I really appreciate what you guys have done at the Institute.
Thank you. And I guess the other thing I would add is the key piece about the volume as well as the interdisciplinary nature. And we also brought in not only academics, but practitioners too, to talk about some of the solutions to these problems. So it was really focused on not only these are the kind of large scale issues and challenges we're talking about, but what are some of the things that we could do to help solve some of these challenges too. And so that was a really exciting piece in this volume, and getting to read all of the things that were coming in as well from different perspectives too.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. The next question is kind of broad, but I'd love to hear all of your perspectives on it. And it's, what do you see as the biggest weakness in our current systems of global governance? And what are some potential ways we could address these issues?
Are we going to start again in the same order, or shall I pick it up? Okay, I'll say a few words about that and pass it on to my colleagues. I think one of the biggest weaknesses in the global system is, I'd like to put it on the part of those who actually have the power as well as the responsibility to make a difference, which are the leaders and the governments of the world. I'm not going to say that they're the only ones that have responsibility, but certainly they have the responsibility and the power to really make changes in the way that the world is formulated at present, and in a way to bring about solutions to the current multiple problems that our planet and humanity faces. So I'm very interested in the role of leadership, government leadership in this area, because unfortunately, I feel the institutions that we have for peace and security are quite outdated. And the world has advanced to a point where this outdated model is no longer feasible. It doesn't work, it's broken. And so I think that's one of the challenges. I think that's one of the major challenges that we face today. And I would simply direct us to think about the current war in Ukraine. I mean, it's the current one. There are many others, but how the system is, there's no common response to this problem, which ultimately impacts the whole planet. And so I think this is the biggest problem.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, the people with the power don't have the vision or the capability to address the problem, and the people with the vision and the interest don't have the power. And even if you get a president or a prime minister in a powerful enough country, let's say a member of the Security Council, who has a vision for what should happen in addition to what's currently being done or instead of it, it is difficult, given the current institutional configuration, to translate long-term solutions by means of short-term steps. That is to say, to get it through the local parliaments, to get it through the Senate in the case of the United States. The fragmentation of authority is such that, on the one hand, fragmentation of authority might be good as a way of checking executive power, but executive power is not sufficient to drive through a vision of long-term remediation. So there are contradictions in the design of institutions, quite in addition to what you mentioned, Hoda, of the outdated nature of collective great power rule, you know, the Security Council paradigm that we have since 1945. So, and even back to 1990, to take the League Council. So yes, there are, the world has changed in its anatomy and in its chemistry, but we're still thinking with the mid-20th century frames of reference.
I agree, and I think just to build on that a little bit, the key challenge here is the inequalities in terms of power, in terms of influence, but also in terms of maybe financial capability, things like that, and this power imbalance that's represented in the institutions because they were created at a particular moment in history. And so maybe what we need to look at is either, which is an ongoing discussion, restructuring the current institutions. There are some suggestions that maybe we need to start creating new ones. I'm not sure how possible that is, but definitely looking at restructuring current institutions, thinking of things like the UN Security Council, where the representative nature of that institution is lacking. But obviously the challenge with that is to restructure that, you have to have the agreement of all the members of the Security Council, and nobody wants to give up power once they have it. And so that's really one of the questions that we need to grapple with. And I guess just to add to that a little bit, perhaps one of the things I was thinking of with this question is a lack of democratization at the international level. Like, we haven't changed the power structures there. It's not truly representative, and it's the people don't necessarily have a say in the way things should be done. And I think that's part of the lack of vision that you were talking about, Michael, in particular, is that doesn't get pushed up to a high enough level.
One of the things that I keep coming back to, one of the questions, I don't know if we've touched on it in the volume, but I don't know, maybe we need another collection of essays to dive more deeply into this, is a question of what comes first. And, you know, some of the great 20th century philosophers have grappled with this, you know, Polanyi and others, Sartre, you know, Cabral, Fanon. Do you begin with consciousness? That is to say, in re-educating people's thoughts about how the world works, what is development, what is technology, what is democracy, what is leadership, what is accountability? Do we re-educate society so that people as citizens, as voters, can choose appropriate leaders, so that those appropriate leaders can address the necessary institutions and set fiscal and monetary policies in such a way as to change institutions? So it's a question, do you change structures in order to change human beings, or do you change human beings in order to change structures? And I don't, that question has not been resolved, but in a sense, it's an implicit question in the volume. Where do we begin? Do we begin at leadership? Do we begin at ethics and knowledge of political economy and how history works? Or do we have a conversation between the two to try to see what are the ways in which we can both change structures, both change knowledges, so that we can change structures and vice versa? But the question of where to begin is something that sort of the volume kind of got to the threshold of.
Michael, I think that's a really important point. And yes, I think we need another volume to just address that. But it seems to me, and you said this, that to raise consciousness, which is so important, actually it should work on both ends. I mean, I think leadership, because, you know, you can't stop the world and wait for both leaders and the rest of humanity to catch up. So I think it's something, what you said about being informed, being educated, understanding who we vote for, what are the issues, not being naive about how in politics, obviously, the desire is to be a winner, is to win the office. And therefore, I don't want to get into too much putting down the system. That's not my purpose here, but there's manipulation, there's all kinds of coercion that goes on. And it's how do you educate and raise consciousness among all of humanity if we really want to have a system which represents everyone, and leaders who then understand that their responsibility is not to just stay in office, but to help those who they are elected to lead.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Moving on to the next questions, the volume has a whole section about technology and peace. So I'd like to ask all of you, what do you see as the biggest opportunities for technology to advance global peace? And what do you see as the biggest potential risks or downsides?
I think Kate should talk about this one.
Okay, sure. So I guess the biggest opportunity I see with technology to start with is its ability to create connections between people, between places. We now have chances to learn about things that we would never have been able to learn about before. We can have a deeper understanding of different places, different cultures. But with every kind of positive comes the negative side of technology. And so what we're also seeing is these creation of echo chambers within different forms of technology. So you have the opportunity to connect, but it's the ways in which these technologies are being used to connect, and how you're then just hearing the same things kind of over and over and over again, and how people don't necessarily approach these things with an analytical perspective or a critical perspective. It's just kind of taken at face value. And so I guess that's one of the downsides, and then also these risks of the unintended consequences with new technologies. So we don't know what's going to happen with the creation of new technology. It doesn't necessarily provide solutions for everything. Like, technology can't be the only solution for everything, and we have to be aware of what the unintended consequences might be. And then I guess in response to kind of the global peace perspective, it has increased awareness about ongoing challenges. It increases awareness about conflicts. If you take Ukraine as an example, at the moment, you're no longer able to say that we didn't know what was going on. We don't know what's happening on the ground. What we also have to be cautious of, though, is what kind of information is coming out of these ongoing conflicts, and what is then being done with that information. And so I think as well, you can see an increased access to information, but it's who has control over your access to that information too. So again, it has the positives, but there's also a potential risk and a potential downside with technologies. And you can kind of see that with, everything going on in the world today, I suppose.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the chapter 7 in the volume on peace engineering, peace finance, and peace data. And in addition, Kate, to the technologies of communication, I'm thinking about the technologies of production and the technologies of financial mobility. And it makes me think back to an old article I saw a long time ago in the development debate about what happens when you introduce technology into a social context. And depending on where you inject the technology and where you inject the capital, it can either decrease inequalities or increase inequalities. And the example that was given was that of the green revolution, meaning not green as in environmentally sustainable, but green in the sense of increasing crop yields from better, using better strains and fertilizers and so on. And what happened in that experiment in the late 50s, 60s, early 70s, was that in injecting the new technologies into an unequal agrarian production system, it increased the power of large landowners and further marginalized small producers and agricultural workers in the countryside. It increased rural-urban migration, increased inequality, increased the gentrification of land, and decreased crop diversity and the thriving of collateral species. And if we take that problem to other areas of production in contemporary world, be it, how we manage water, move water, how we produce food, how we generate energy and move energy and store it. All of these technologies that are so critical for our survival in the 21st century, this contribution is asking us, are we thinking about the social context into which we inject capital and technology? And to simply say we take the Millennium Development Goals and we want to decrease poverty and we want to empower people and so on, what is the social context within which we are trying to operationalize these goals? Are we taking into consideration what the nature of the technology is, what its capital and startup costs are, who will receive it, and who will benefit from the deployment of these technologies? So it seems to me that unless we embed our conversation about technology within a critique of social context and social dynamics, we might add to our problems rather than decrease them.
I don't have much to add, but what both of you have said reminds me of this issue that we keep grappling with over the decades is how much decision-making should happen by those who live at the grassroots rather than imposed from above, right? And I think with technology, I mean, I was first and foremost thinking about how even in terms of human resource development, how the world is so lopsided, you know, with certain countries really not having the opportunities for citizens to get the kind of training and develop the kind of human resources that are necessary to decide on their own, in their own context, in their own environment, how to apply technology to what it is that they know they need best and better than others. And I think this whole issue of how to, I mean, I want to say we need to make education universal. We need to, but by that I mean, you know, not only elementary, middle, high school, but university, and resources to be put in place that throughout all the countries of the world, in other words, all the peoples of the world, regardless of their background, potential, etc., have the capacity to participate and have opportunities to develop their own human capacities and talents, so that the human resources are put to the best use of, again, what that community needs, which the experts are within that community and cannot always be from outside. I think this is a real challenge that we have not yet found a good solution to, but it's a profound problem.
And I think too, the other chapters in the volume too, this idea of social context that you're talking about, Michael, the other chapters in the technology section do a really good job of thinking about that too. So thinking about Derek Kalin's chapter, looking at alternatives to current social media, which I know Stella just recently wrote a blog post about, but also the chapter from Helena and Maud on understanding digital conflict drivers too, how technology is used in different contexts is really is a really crucial point that I think you raised there.
Yeah, and technologies that affect the body. I mean, I'm thinking of the impact of the use of certain kinds of fertilizers and agricultural practices, particularly in hinterland and indigenous spaces that affect the reproductive health of those communities. So, you know, questions like how, I mean, it's not necessarily addressed in this volume, but how do we preserve our food? How do we crossbreed plants? Are we crossbreeding them for the best vitamin retention, or are we crossbreeding them so that the plants can travel, can be packed and shipped over long distances to satisfy markets? So we engineer food according to their marketability and logistics rather than according to their nutritional value and environmental impact at the point of production. You know, what kinds of medical technologies, whether for fighting pandemics or for reproductive health, are being invented and proliferated, and who gets access to them? Who gets to reproduce standardized antiviral and anti-COVID vaccines, and who retains intellectual knowledge power over these patents, and for how long? At what point do you democratize the production of COVID vaccines and allow the Brazils and the Cubas to replicate them, and India and South Africa and these other countries who have the capability? So these are cross-cutting questions of technology as well, that affect, you know, social context and impact.
Yeah, Professor Allen, you just touched on sort of a big thing of the intersection between aspects like climate change, technology, power. So that kind of leads me into my next question, which is, what are the biggest links you've seen between the problems of climate change and global peace? And what forces do you see linking various forms and systems of inequality around the world?
Were you directing that to me?
I'd love if you'd start us off.
Well, I mean, if you see some of my other writings, in a word, global capitalism, that is the big connector. Then the dominance of that style of producing and exchanging goods and services that has mutated over millennia since the early trade routes has created an archetype of reproduction that is sophisticated. It is modernizing. It generates new technologies. It brings people into contact with each other, but it also creates a dynamic of creating wealth at the top and extractive exhaustion at the bottom. And it moves like a hurricane. It travels around the world, and as it travels, it mutates and it generates new ideas and new technologies. So it's very exciting, but it is also very exhaustive. At some moments, it promotes liberal democracies, and at other moments, it undermines it. And we are seeing it now in the nature of politics, even in the OECD countries, where in the 1980s, we had a wave of democratizations because the markets required transparency and legibility and so on. But at a certain moment, as it creates income inequalities between classes and the movement of jobs around the world, it creates resentments. And then we have the politics of anti-immigrant and the xenophobia and so on, and people want to capture the old forms of politics again, and it creates these backlashes. So, it's a dynamic and exciting system that globalizes contact and globalizes discourse and generates technologies of communication, but it has this contradictory effect of increasing inequalities and increasing marginalizations, and creates disruptions in its own discourses. It promotes democracy and liberal notions of freedom of association, but it also creates these conflicts that drive people crazy. So that's, my feeling is, the research that I've done and the analysis in thinking about these large systems is that we can't wait for the system's contradictions in some kind of a Marxian revolutionary way to happen. It's not going to happen that way, in my view. Because we have to find ways outside of the system to counterbalance it, and then to have a conversation from a position of greater equality with the system, so that both its technologies and the democracy that comes from beyond it can sort of have a more mutual way of modernizing the world, shall we say, or post-modernizing the world, or post-colonizing the world, if you will. But I just give me, in short, the thesis of my next book. But
and I think to follow up on that too, I think one of the things I wanted to pick out on that, especially what you were saying towards the end, is thinking about it from a post-colonial perspective, but also recognizing the historical connections that a lot of these systems have and the inherent inequalities within these systems. So their foundations are in colonialism and within slavery, and the institutions created there are still in operation today. So the inherent inequalities are still within the system, and those are now being exacerbated by climate change, with resource shortages, changing landscapes, like, as you said, the movement of populations. And so how do we, as you said, how do we balance this or push back against this?
Yeah, I largely, forgive me for speaking so much, but I largely agree with that, Kate, except I would say that many of these archetypal elements of this giant hurricane monster that has been evolving for millennia took on particular characteristics after the age of Columbus and so on. It took on particular, but the archetypes had been there before, had been there from the period of the Silk Road, from the East African trade with southern China, from the trade in Indonesia and the South China Sea, which predated colonialism. And if we go further back into antiquity, we can see elements of it in the ancient empires, the suzerainty systems of world order, these treaties between, the Hittites and other communities, the Persian basin and the empires that were constructed. You look at the techniques of population displacement, infrastructure construction under Darius and these ancient emperors. We see many of the similar elements that today we would criticize from a post-colonial perspective. So the permutations and the mutations that have happened to global capitalism since the 15th century in the West-centric sort of moment have had particular characteristics, including its racialism and the justifications of inequality in modern terms. But it has always been there in seed form, I would argue.
You know, again, Kate and Michael are the political scientists and international relations people, but I always struggle with this notion that we are supposedly in the age of equality and have been supposedly since, you know, beginning with the Enlightenment, but moving further. But I find it very difficult to see any form of genuine equality permeating the institutions and also within the social context that we're talking about. And I wonder what, you know, again, I know that some of the chapters, especially on inequalities, touched upon this, but it seems like perhaps we have moved into a new age where we think about equality as being extremely important, but really we are still again behaving similar to some of the institutions that have existed in the way past, you know, and I think this is a question that I really have, and I'm not supposed to ask questions, but I really wonder, how do we get past this old model that has been passed down throughout our history?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you guys so much for that. I'm going to ask you all one more question. And while you respond to that, I encourage anyone in the audience who has a question to maybe start typing out their question in the Q&A function. That way we can address any questions that the audience has after we finish with this next question. So we've been looking a lot at the past. I'd like to look a little bit at the present. While you were working and compiling this work, you didn't know what was going to be happening in the world when it came out. However, a lot of the topics and essays are extremely timely. So I'd like to know what connections you see between this book and its themes and current events like the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the global response to that.
That's a great question. No, we didn't in 2018, and when we started this process, we didn't foresee what would be in place when the book was released in 2022. But I think this is a good example of, again, how no matter where in time we enter into a discussion about the global problems of peace and security, that there will always be something happening that says, you know, how timely that this was published. You know, I think that's really how this came about, is that we were concerned back a few years ago about what is happening in the world and how we don't seem to have a very good response and I'll put it back. I mean, the nations just simply have to find a better way of coordinating their roles and becoming a community of nations who, rather than constantly engaging in contestation and competition, begin to examine how they need to cooperate in order to really heal this planet and its peoples. I mean, this is really where we're at. So that the book came out at a timely, at a very good time. We're very happy about that. But I would say we need many, many books and many, many human actions, especially on the part of those in power, but also all of us, to try to change this world and its institutions to formulate a new, different world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Stella, you asked, you're thinking about the war in Ukraine as a more recent event since the book has come out. I'm also thinking about the consolidation of ownership in social media. I mean, Elon Musk is buying Twitter. What are the implications of that for governance of the mediascape, for the nature of discourse, for the reproduction of both useful and pathological conversations? Yeah, we, as I look back at the chapters on both global governance and on media and media governance, it all gives me goosebumps to see the kinds of resonance between the recent events and the conversations raised in the volume.
I think so. And I think the only thing I would add is when we started and we were planning the conference, the kind of themes we chose were related to large scale challenges and problems that we saw happening at that moment in time. And obviously we had no idea how that would develop going forward, but these are themes that have been kind of running through global governance, running through other large scale topics, and have been posing challenges for a while. And what has happened in the past few years has really just kind of brought that to a sort of head, I suppose. And so I think if we think of things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it does highlight things like leadership and global governance, the ways in which different institutions have responded, different individual leaders have responded, the technology questions, which I mentioned earlier about how news about the war has been shared on social media, other issues about kind of structural inequalities and how that may have led to the conflict, or this need for power and influence within the international system, and the kind of inability of some of the institutions to respond. So say the UN Security Council, for example, with Russia being a permanent member and a veto, how that kind of freezes up the response at the global level. So I think a lot of the things that we talk about in the book are really, really highlighted by current events. I guess in a way that I would sort of hope they might not have been had things gone better in the world. But maybe contributions like this can kind of start a conversation, and we can push more for change going forward. That's the goal, I think.
Yes, but let me ask a troublesome question, if I may. We talk about institutions, we talk about leadership, and we talk about historical patterns and dynamics. But to an extent, the Security Council was designed according to what was feasible in 1945. And it survived the Cold War, so to speak, but it was not able to solve problems involving the great powers themselves. So only on those moments where great power interests were neutral, shall we say, or neutralized or counterbalanced, was there a measure of moderate effectiveness for conflicts that did not involve them directly. And one could argue that, speaking about technology, in a sense, the basis of world order during the Cold War was nuclear deterrence and not so much collective great power rule. And if we think about the current conflict now in Ukraine, one has to ask, is the restraint that's being exercised by other powers in response to Russia occasioned by its nuclear capability rather than by the constraints of the international legal order?
That's a really good question. But I think, Michael, in a sense, we're saying we made it through the Cold War with the structures that the UN set up, but now we are in a whole new territory, and have been. I don't mean immediate now. I mean really since the collapse of the former Soviet Union, we are in new territory. And again, it seems like we don't have a model that work for where the world has moved to, and is moving forward very quickly, you know. But But that's a very important question about nuclear deterrence versus a response from at least a certain group of nations to bring an end to this war in Ukraine. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think we see a difference in how this incident of conflict is being responded to in relation to other more recent conflicts. And I do think you're right in that the nuclear capability adds an additional layer of complexity to that, because there is the capability to escalate to that, and that has been discussed. I know, for example, and that on a Russian TV station recently, one of the kind of Putin supporters had shown a map of the UK and Ireland being obliterated by a nuclear bomb. So it's not that it's not, like, it is a reality of this situation. And I guess the fundamental question I have with that is, like, you can't put everything back in the box. Like, you can't close the gate after the horse is bolted. So nuclear weapons are a reality in today's world. So how do we deal with that in a different way, rather than relying on mutually assured destruction, whose acronym is MAD? Like, that kind of sums it up. And how do we deal with this technology that is now out in the world, and you can't remove that, you can't scrub that from history. There's always, that knowledge is out there. When we think of unintended consequences of technological development, so how do we, and the risks that come with that, how do we deal with that in a different way than we have? And it does seem like there isn't an alternative at the moment. But how would we make that a possibility, I guess, is my return question.
Michael, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the strategy of the other powers at the moment is rational. I mean, there are several scales on which a calculus is being made. There's a calculus of how do we support Ukrainians in defending their lives and their sovereignty. There's a question of restraint. If NATO countries go in, then it really becomes a continental war, and the destruction is even greater, and the risks of escalation even greater. So in a sense, you almost have to relegate. You have to treat Ukraine as one big Coventry. Speaking of the Second World War, and let the dying happen there, rather than happen on a larger scale, as cruel as that might sound. But there is a certain brutal choice, given the possibility of nuclear escalation, given the implications of that. But the other thing I'm thinking of is the nature of human agency and decision-making, because all of this depends on the leaders in all sides of the conflict playing by rational calculi. We say, well, what are Putin's possible options, and what are the capabilities, and so on around the field, and then presuming that we can respond and anticipate based on these rational presumptions. But what if all decision making is not necessarily rational? Because all the things we talk about, what do we do about not necessarily armed conflict, as in this case, but all the other challenges that we've been addressing, the inequality, the environmental threats, the gender inequalities, and so on. All of these are coming from, these questions are coming from a modernist cosmology of rational thought and rational decision making. We take data into account, we take historical precedent into account, we take patterns into account, and then from these rational calculi, we say, okay, here's what we can expect, and here are some things we can do. But it all presumes that human beings at whatever level of citizens or leadership will vote rationally, will make decisions rationally, will calculate the least loss of life and the greatest prosperity in a given configuration and so on. We are putting faith in the human capacity for rational thought. But what if our archetypes of thought are not always rational?
Yeah.
According to those modern paradigms, be they liberal or center-right or social democratic or environmentalist or whatever, all of these paradigms of thought depend upon a presumption of human rationality.
And Michael, I think to that point, and Kate, when you mentioned these weapons, nuclear weapons, the fact that right now it's the people in Ukraine that are dying, as you said, Michael, and somehow the rest of the world might feel somewhat safe. I think this is, again, what kind of a solution is this to the problem? And with nuclear weapons, imagining a different world now. I mean, to imagine a different world. Obviously, it seems that a huge demilitarization needs to take place on the planet, because even weapons of mass destruction, weapons in general, the technology in this area has become such a moneymaker. I mean, let's not forget this, that for many countries, this is such a great economic plus, to sell these weapons. But the more we do this, the more we infiltrate, the more we spread these weapons, I mean, ultimately, one hopes for rationality, but I'm not so convinced. I think that the possibility of, and I'm not talking about a mistake, of someone actually using a weapon, a nuclear weapon, if you have these weapons, ultimately someone will decide to use them. And that's why I'm really pushing for this change of institutional prowess, to come up with new institutions, different way of examining things. I mean, the UN in particular is a time to re-examine its role and to, begin to perhaps rewrite some of the memorandum of understanding or whatever, to reflect more the very seriousness of the world that we have now come to in terms of these very difficult and existential threats to humanity.
But what are to be the fora of decision making and deliberation? Is it the territorial polity? Our volume describes a world that has evolved away from being composed primarily of territorial societies, that we have transnational networks that bring people together as intimately as neighborhoods do, or a shared sort of Andersonian identity space does. So, but the architecture since Westphalia is that we make political decisions about our respective futures around the world on the basis of this deliberative space. And when we speak about democracy, we're speaking about democracy in this deliberative space, the territorial polity. But the territorial polity is not the only, or perhaps even the most powerful formation of human collectivity. We have social media it is not territorial at all. We have planetary space in which we share vulnerabilities, which we describe in the volume, vulnerabilities to pandemics, vulnerabilities to air masses and climate change and so on. So the configuration, many of the powerful configurations are global, but the decision-making fora and the discursive space is still largely Westphalian, still largely territorial. And so the question is the territorial space still the key space in which those questions that you raised, Hoda, is it still the space in which we need to articulate and change ethics and aesthetics and aspirations? What is the discursive space in which we have the conversation that you have raised?
I am so glad that you guys have had so much to say. about that last question, but I do want to start going into the audience questions because the first one does relate to what you're talking about right now. And it says, if amazingly every ruler of every nation received your book and their various parliaments, parties, and legislatures were all on board, and they asked each of you, please tell us how, specifically, now, we should construct a world synthesis order to ensure peace. What is each of your quick and dirty take, your summary elevator reply to what the world must do? I know that's kind of a tough one.
I think that builds on what Michael was saying, is thinking about where decisions are made and who's making the decisions, and then how that influences different levels. So if you pull it out to the different levels, what are the impacts at the global, what are the impacts at the state level, at the local level, where are these decisions being made, and who holds the influence in those? I guess my quick take would be, how do we get people to think outside of themselves? So it's really easy. I think this comes back to the earlier conversations about rationality too. It's really easy to be rational when you're not involved in the situation. So we can be very rational about how we think people should be responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily have a huge direct impact on us. Obviously that shifts if you're currently living in Ukraine or trying to get out of the country. And so I think it really requires taking yourself and putting yourself in somebody else's position on a more frequent basis than most people do on a day-to-day basis. So recognizing at an individual level is also really important. So how can I have an influence? How can I change things? Which oftentimes you can, especially in the face of things like climate change, you think, well, if I change, it doesn't matter because then nobody else is going to change. So it becomes a tragedy of the commons type situation. And so I think it requires change at every level. But I think if people are looking for what they can do, it starts with the individual level, because the things that you do on a daily basis, who you vote for has an impact. And that then feeds up the levels too. And now I'm not sure if that made sense, but that's what I would push for, is to be less selfish if you can.
I wish we had more models of selflessness in the world, but I think that the difficulty is, and it would be wonderful if the leaders. I mean, I think again, back to Michael's question, I think national sovereignty is just I don't think it exists anymore. I may be wrong, but I don't think it does. But yet we try to cling to it, And so for me, we need new institutions, representative of the countries of the world. Where the countries of the world elect representatives to a higher institution, where the resources of the planet are taken into consideration and their distribution is considered. I mean, without that, it will continue to be the survival of the most powerful. Constantly. And I mean, either we continue that model, which I don't think has a very good future, or we come up with an alternative to that. I don't know.
My elevator pitch would link what Kate has said with what Hoda has invited us to think about via this step. If the world economy is the Titanic and climate change is the iceberg we're going to hit, and since we know we're going to hit it, I would invite, if the countries of the world are cabins, and if the bulk goods in the bottom of the ship are the natural resources of forests and so on, that each cabin has access to, I would ask the leaders of each cabin to allow their citizens to construct alternate models with the resources they have at their disposal. And when those models, a new way of producing goods and services, a new way of living together, and let those experiments, Hoda talked about a lack of examples, create good examples of an alternative outside of global capitalism. So democracy for me in the 21st century, if we are to get anywhere, democracy is not only about choice of leaders, it's about choice of models. Since the territorial state is still the space in which people live, it is still the space in which we control forests and soils and growing areas and mountain runoffs and so on. Use what's left of the Westphalian sovereignty to allow multiple experiments in an alternative way of doing things. We are not going to defeat global capitalism by frontal confrontation. If you get left-wing governments in Latin America being voted into office, and they say we're going to change our model using the power of the state does not have the kind of power to resist the backlash from Washington. It simply does not. We've seen it again and again since Allende. You try it, same thing in the Caribbean with Manley. You try it, they're going to find a way to get you out by assassination, by someone or frustrating your financial system. So don't try to assault the beast head on. Build an alternative first, and when enough people see a choice between the old way and the new way, then you begin to say, the global system that has access to your natural resources and your markets, we need representation in a new kind of multilateral body. To get to Hoda's point, we can't get to the new kind of global decision-making body without first building power at the base to challenge the central system. Since the central system is a problem and has been so for millennia and keeps adding new dimensions and pathologies to world politics, racism and environmental destruction and so on, we have to go outside of it to challenge it into a kind of a stalemate, if you will, in which now you say, we don't have to buy from you because we can eat independently. We don't have to buy from you because we can light our homes independent of you. We don't have to buy from you because we can educate our kids independent of you. Then we say, no, if you still want to talk, let's talk. And let us construct new institutions that are based on representation, sustainability, respect for human rights, and so on. We will still buy your computers. We won't buy so many rockets from you. We'll buy research equipment. To me, I don't, well, yeah. Again, so we have to take the realities of power into consideration while also thinking how we can use power to realize new kinds of aspiration.
Thank you so much. Let's go on to our next audience question, which says, education featured greatly in your discussion as a cross-cutting issue. Could you address the issues of the kind of education delivered? Having gone through the British colonial education and the American education, there is a huge contrast. The latter emphasizes being analytical, while the former is more reproducing what is taught. This has great impact on how people and leaders address complex world issues.
Who wants to take that one? Michael.
Well, I'm a product of both. Well, a product of one and a producer in another. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, that dichotomy between British style and American style education, but I'd like to think that in the Caribbean, we invented new ways of synthesis, and since we got all of it dumped on us in a kind of a colonial context, we found ways of resisting and synthesizing. But on the question of educational curricula, I would argue that the dominant paradigm has educated the world by drawing people out of villages and into metropolises to produce higher education. And having done so, they create an urban professional classes, which then circulate capital and knowledge among themselves at the top of the world, so to speak, at the top third of the world, straddling across different territorial spaces. I would argue that we should reverse the flow of knowledge reproduction by instead of bringing people to knowledge, we should take knowledge to people. So that if your primary school is your first level of contact with modern education, it should also perhaps at night become the local polytechnic university, and that the curriculum should emphasize not just critical thinking, authenticity in terms of incorporating indigenous and local cultures and languages, but also empowering people to produce their own food, energy, and transportation to the extent they can, or to minimize dependence on certainly fossil fuel transportation. But certainly in terms of housing, things like using local water sources for hydropower, small scale, small is beautiful, Schumacher kinds of knowledge proliferation. So I'd say inject knowledge and microcapital as low as possible in the social order, and reverse the flow of knowledge. If you reverse the flow of knowledge, you also put lower pressure on rural urban migration, and you democratize knowledge, so to speak. A kind of knowledge that allows you to reproduce production in a more sustainable way. So it's the building lifeboats model, that the educational philosophy should be lifeboats before five-star cabins.
The next question continues in the same kind of vein about education. And it says, I have a question that is based on a life of work with a PhD in education in dozens of countries and a focus on rural populations. The question is this: the educational systems in all countries are based upon the needs of the larger agro-industrial economic, not social, needs of nations and global systems. The lack of focus on local socioeconomic needs has created worldwide educational systems that have served as the management process of rural to urban migration, leaving the lower academic performers to form the impoverished laboring class that must also abandon the rural area, and they have only the one choice of populating the urban slums. That group has no choice as the village collapses around them. The educational systems, from a national point of view, is only interested in basic word and number literacies to serve in the national economies. There is no effort at this time in the developed or the lesser developed world to answer local social and economic learning and local skill needs. This has led to our chicken and the egg problem of where do we start? And the question is, how do we address this globally local issue?
I think that's kind of everything Michael just said, oddly enough. He preceded the question. Yeah, I don't know if I have much to add to that. I guess one of the thoughts I was having with that is maybe there are ways, this is one of the ways that new technology could assist in a positive manner in terms of democratizing knowledge production. If we think of the ways that, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of, this is stream of consciousness talking. If you think of the ways that now you can kind of find anything on YouTube, for example, that gives you access to a wealth of knowledge that you wouldn't necessarily have had before. But we have the downside of it promoting certain areas, certain topics. English speaking videos tend to be promoted higher, etc. So if there is a way to, again, flip that so that more locally produced knowledge is spread more widely. So trying to reverse these flows of knowledge that Michael was talking about, I think is crucial. Also giving people access to educational opportunities that they may not have had in the past because of technology means you don't necessarily have to relocate out of your current location. How do we make that accessible and affordable for everybody? And so you're not having to move to be able to do that. And yeah, trying to reverse the top-down approach that we often see, I think is a good way forward.
Yeah.
Again, I think this is part of the whole discussion we've been having about outdated institutions. And I think, and I'm not, dismissing the institution of education, but I think, I can't help but look at this again from a global perspective because we've become so small. This planet has just become so small, whether we like it or not. I mean, there's just no other way of escaping it, what it has become. It has become. So with education, again, I feel that, for example, United Nations, again, organizations that have an international reach is one form of trying to develop the kind of institutions that reach out to everyone on this planet, that allow everyone the opportunity to receive a proper education that prepares them for the kind of world that we are in and advancing in. You know, I think this is to get people to think about how to respond to a changing world, which throws things at us, you know, day to day. This is so critical. And I think it goes back to what I said at the very beginning about developing human resources. You know, without across the board development of human resources in any given territory or country, it's impossible for that society to be able to reach its highest potential. And I think this is where education that deals with technological skills, but also with critical thinking skills, all of the good aspects of a good education become very important. But again, what we have is, you know, it's not the kind of system that allows access to everyone in any given society. And I think this is a problem, because then you have large segments of our population globally who are not receiving the opportunities that they should have, just like anyone else.
I like your point, Hoda, about the new kind of thinking in democratizing knowledge, not just democratizing knowledge in existing styles of thinking, but democratizing knowledge with a sort of fluid thinking, if you will, to teach people to think so that at any point that you step in the stream, you understand what a whirlpool is, you understand what an eddy is, and so you're not surprised by a new pattern that you see because you've seen it before, although in particular configurations and manifestations across time. But it seems to me that in the short term, at least, if were we to be successful in democratizing this kind of fluid thinking, critical thinking that is not surprised by change, shall we say, it might run up to ossified thinking in some established paradigms of not only of modernity, but also of religious thought and certain traditional worldviews. You're going to run into where you're trying to flow as water, we might run into icebergs, you know, and depending on the temperature of the water, we might either melt it or it might freeze us.
Yeah.
So in the short term, fluid thinking can generate conflict too, intrapersonal conflict as well as interpersonal conflict. So we have to think about peaceful ways of democratizing knowledge or managing the consequences of people's enlightenment moments. I don't want to use a prejudiced Western word, but moments in which we break out of old confinements to new vistas can be painful at a personal level until we see the benefit of this larger, of breathing this in this bigger space. So yeah, I think I like your point about changing not just the access to education, but the modalities of thought in education.
Thank you all so much. We don't have any more audience questions, but thank you so much for all the great questions we did get. I would like to end us off on kind of a positive note by asking you guys what makes you hopeful for the future or inspires you to continue this work despite the many challenges.
Okay, I'm going to start this one. I always like talking about hope. You know, being on a university campus and being exposed to the younger generation, the students, is one of the highlights of my day-to-day activity. Because I see in the younger generation great hope. They are working on new ideas. They're trying to find new ways to address issues, climate change, inequalities, all the things that we've talked about. And they are genuinely interested in making a change in this world. And I'm very hopeful about that. And I hope that these students will understand as they get into the real world and find their jobs and find their niche, that it takes great effort to collaborate, cooperate with others, and to find points of common understanding in order to really move forward great ideas, great examples of new models, that effort to reach out to others that are like-minded and to find solutions to the problems that are realistic. I think that is where the younger generation can really help to bring more positive approaches to how to fix this world that is so broken. But I'm hopeful because I think humanity has always shown, there's a spirit in humanity that always shows its capacity to overcome the most difficult of circumstances and move forward.
Yes, I would agree with that. It's what keeps me going as a teacher and researcher in the university system. Students are the great joy of this role, and yeah, that's a big one for me as well, Hoda. And I would also say the capacity, in spite of the inequalities and the the problems that we've cited, there is this deep human need for love. And by love, I don't necessarily mean, the Eros version, but love as community, love as human contact, love as joy in community. No matter culture or religion or place, there's a space in the human heart that longs for that. And as long as that is there, if that governs our rationality, we can get somewhere. If instead our rationality is overtaken by short-term thinking and short-term lust for power, then it has a way of eclipsing or sidelining. I'm thinking about so many experiences that I've noticed, and even on campus, as we slowly return to a degree of normality post-pandemic, people have been thirsting for contact. It's one thing to see each other on a screen. It's another thing to be in the same room, in the same lunch space, the same, circles with friends, and I see them eye to eye, and that there's a thirst for human contact. It's what makes us fully human, to have the joy of companionship and friendship in a real place. And I think to the extent that we need that as human beings, and we become conscious of how we cultivate it, that desire for that greater humanity, whether informed by some spiritual insight or not, we come from different faith communities or might not be informed by a particular faith. But this need for love, I think, is a human, it comes with being human, just like reason and emotion and a sense of beauty. And I think that if we can surface these and build our institutions or aspirations around them, then I have hope, yes.
I just wholeheartedly agree with everything that you have both said. And I think, just to add to that, the thing that also helps give me hope is that there are people working on solutions constantly. I think students are doing it, academics are doing it, practitioners out in the field are doing it. And doing a project like this where you get to meet so many people from different places, all of whom are working in their own ways to find solutions to these challenges, is one of the things that, gives me hope and inspires me every day. and yeah, gives me hope for the future in that people are working towards kind of common goals and common good as well.
All right, we're just about at our end of time. So I want to say thank you so much. We feel so lucky to have had these great panelists here with us today. And also everyone in the audience, thank you for attending. We don't have any upcoming events to announce because the semester is coming to an end. So we're especially grateful that everyone who works in the university system was able to come and attend today, because we know the end of the semester is a very hectic time. But I think this was a very productive talk. Thank you so much and goodbye.